It looks like there are essentially two reasons why we've seen this big reshuffle at the top of the Ukrainian government. It is the largest reshuffle we've seen since the war. When it comes to, firstly, the chief of the SBU, basically what we've seen there is that has been something that has been a long time coming. So it's something that Politico has been reporting on for a while, that this was Ivan Bakanov, who is an old friend of Vladimir Zelensky, who is someone he grew up with from his hometown. He was put in charge of the security services, essentially as sort of a cleaning house exercise for Vladimir Zelensky when he came to power, because this was a really unwieldy and large department. There are around about 30,000 employees. That's huge when you compare it, for instance, to MI5. It's larger than MI5. It's almost as large as the US security services. So it was a really unwieldy beast, and there have been long-term allegations of corruption and of all sorts of issues within that. So Bakanov was brought in as someone who could clean house, someone who was brand new. He didn't have a background in this area. He's got training as a lawyer, used to run Zelensky's company. But in the wake of the war, the challenges facing that department have been significant. And what Zelensky has found is that Bakanov was just not up to the task. And that was particularly clear in the early days of the war, when rather than actually blow up a key bridge that led to the Kherson town, which is the only really large and significant gain that the Russians were able to get early on in the war, that bridge was left standing, and essentially it allowed the Russians to come in and take that town. And that was blamed largely on the fact that there wasn't a clean house and that Bakanov hadn't been running a tight ship. When it comes to the prosecutor general, that is a slightly more complex question. And some of the speculation that we're seeing is that that could be because essentially the prosecutor general has in some ways been seen as someone who is not particularly one would say free of corruption herself. And that's something that various critics have pointed to, the fact that she has tanked several investigations into key figures in the Zelensky cabinet and in the Zelensky group. So essentially, she was seen as someone who might have been compromised and might not be as anti-corruption as some in the West would have her be. And in fact, the European Union has said that what Ukraine needed in order to speed up its accession talks with the EU, in order to speed up its entry negotiations, is to appoint an independent prosecutor general. So that is probably the speculation in terms of why she had to go. She was seen in the EU as someone who was weak in the role that she was in, and this was Zelensky in a nod to the EU, essentially getting rid of her.
How complicated would it be to weed out all Russian sympathisers given the history between the two nations?
It will be very, very difficult. And that's something that Zelensky said in his address on Sunday night when he was talking about the fact that he had gotten rid of these two key figures. He said that the reason he had done that was because of the fact that there were many people who were collaborators within those two departments, and that there were people who had been found to be working with the Russians and feeding information into the Russians about the operations of Ukraine's war efforts. But certainly we've seen very large numbers of people now starting to get weeded out, starting to get prosecuted, and there are allegations about many others as well.
I mean, there was also talk of at least 60 staff accused of working for Russia in Russia-occupied Ukraine. How difficult is that when really they are captive by Russia?
I think what Zelensky has been talking about are the people who have been essentially working in these administrations for these mayors or these various these kind of regional heads that have been installed by Russia. And Zelensky has said in the past, and he continues to say, that those people are running essentially treasonous governments, and that anyone who cooperates with them is part of that effort to essentially sow discord in Ukraine and to invade Ukraine. So it's something that we know the Ukrainians would be targeting, anyone who is working with those regimes that are installed by the Kremlin.
You know, you talked about the invasion of Kherson. How might it have compromised Ukraine's effort in other ways?
It's a really significant part of Ukraine. Kherson is a really strategically key city, and it's the largest city that the Russians have captured. It's important because it's in this essential kind of land bridge area where the Russians have been trying to create a land bridge from their territory and all the way down into the south where Ukraine's key Black Sea ports are. So it is very key that this city was lost, particularly because it is the scene of some of the really key issues with respect to getting grain out of Ukraine. So the fact that the Russians have been able to take that city has been really key in allowing them to keep those Black Sea ports blockaded. And that's something that Ukraine sees as a really vital strategic goal, to recapture some of these Black Sea areas. And it's something that the Russians are using to extract all sorts of things from the Ukrainians and from the West, because they know that keeping Ukraine's grain captured within the country, or being able to steal that grain to sell it themselves, essentially keeps the world on notice that they could cause a famine at any time in the Middle East and in Africa as well, which really relies on Ukrainian grain.
And Zoya, what do we understand is behind the renewed barrage of Russian missile attacks, predominantly on civilian targets?
It's been really troubling to see. We've seen over the past few days, in fact, over the past couple of weeks, a real escalation in the civilian casualties and in terms of the barrage of missile attacks on various civilian spots. We have seen these horrible pictures coming out of some places, a young girl who was killed in a missile strike a few days ago. And over the weekend, Sergei Shoigu, who is the Russian defense minister, has said that the Russians are going to redouble their efforts and really continue hammering Ukraine. And that is, of course, going to mean more civilian casualties. And they need to continue to put pressure on the Ukrainians, particularly because we have these conversations at the moment, these negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians being brokered by the Turkish President Erdogan. And that is something that the Russians use. So they use these opportunities to place greater pressure on the Ukrainians so that there's more pressure for them to concede in these sorts of negotiations.
And almost destruction for destruction's sake. Zoya, really good to get your perspective on these developments. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.